I first heard about Solomon Wiese on a bright, blustery day on the South Bank. The man who told me about him, standing opposite me outside the Royal Festival Hall, within sight of the river, which could be observed heaving like horrible grey jelly, was the head of a small publishing company, and had mentioned the name Solomon Wiese in connection, I thought, with a literary scandal from earlier in the year. Before this happened, I hadn't really been listening to the head of the small publishing company, although outwardly I was nodding, saying, and even occasionally generating an entire sentence. There were two reasons that I hadn't been listening to the head of the small publishing company, apart from the obvious ones, that the head of the small publishing company was not a particularly enthralling conversationalist, for example, or the atmosphere of generalized boredom that mists these kinds of encounters, especially when they take place among a long series, as this one did, that closely resemble each other in tone and subject matter. The first reason was the presence, next to him on my left, of his wife, who I remembered was a dentist, or in training to be a dentist, and like me had remained largely silent during the head of the small publishing company's discourse. As he spoke, I had become increasingly aware of her and her position relative to me in the small triangle we formed, standing on the biscuity concrete. I had been reminded of her name moments before, but hadn't succeeded in retaining it. And although she had refrained from speaking almost entirely, and although I was able to prevent myself from sliding my eyes leftwards to look at her, the fact of her presence began to weigh on me more and more heavily, accompanied by a growing certainty that for seconds at a time she was staring at me, specifically at an area around my left shoulder, quite close to my neck. I was facing away from the water, and it was possible, even quite likely, that the head of the small publishing company's wife was simply taking glances beyond me towards its surface, I thought, as the mouth of the head of the small publishing company continued to move. Without turning my head, I could see the water, too, in the far reaches of my vision, registering as little more than a restless effect of the light. It was possible it was to this area behind me where the river continued its dissatisfied heaving motions that her eyes were drawn. It was possible, but it wasn't my feeling. That the head of the small publishing company's wife was uninterested in the conversation and seeking distraction in the view wouldn't have been difficult to explain, I thought. But I had met her 2 or 3 times before at similar gatherings, and if she had refrained from speaking more than absolutely necessary, she had at least always managed to give the impression that she was participating. Her devices remained pocketed, and she faced the spectacle of literary society with an expression that wasn't bored or impatient, but carefully interested. If you looked at her during the conversation, she would be smiling at a moment of mock obtuseness, or nodding minutely during one of the flat stretches. She had been to enough of these events, I reasoned, while the head of the small publishing company continued to speak, to have got far beyond wondering what she was doing at them. She no longer questioned their purpose, if she ever had. The literary events of her husband's professional world, with their warm hubbub, the haze of alcohol that clung to your clothes, the tired charades and the endless gossip. Yet, to look at her, you felt that she had questioned them. In the past, perhaps in acid tones. That was all behind her now. She had become fully, numbly accepting of them. She attended unquestioningly as a matter of principle in support of her husband, who no doubt attended in a symmetrical way, I imagined, the social events around dentistry that surely took place from time to time, possibly in parts of the city very near this location, on the South Bank, the so-called cultural hub of the capital, and which she was obliged to mark in their calendar months in advance, so as not to spring one of these occasions on him without allowing him adequate time to psychologically prepare himself. It must be the same for her, too. Could it be, I wondered, that the wife of the head of the small publishing company had, during this conversation, reached a new plateau of boredom, so that she was on the brink of embarking on a course of action beyond her usual range? Or that she had become, despite everything, interested? I was forced to hold this thought at bay, as the head of the small publishing company's face indicated he required a response. He still had not mentioned the name Solomon Wiese, and I provided a statement neither so specific as to betray my inattention, nor so broad as to seem evasive, and in the opening that followed, I took my opportunity and glanced at the head of the small publishing company's wife. It was as I suspected. Her gaze was not cast towards the grey surface of the river, or at the distant attractions arrayed on its far bank, but hovered instead in the region of my left shoulder, possibly around the collar of my shirt.